What do single family real estate investors get wrong when they make the jump to multifamily? I can talk about the big moves to fives to tens to 20s, but Jonathan here, he could talk about going to the hundreds. So we're going to have a quick conversation about what single family or even retail investors get wrong about multifamily, specifically bigger and bigger projects. Jonathan, what is something people get wrong?
So probably the biggest thing that people get wrong about, well, God, there are so many things, but let's just talk about the property itself. The first thing that comes to mind that people get wrong about bigger properties is that as much as you're buying a piece of real estate, you're also buying an operating business with a large multifamily, right? It's not like a single, if you've got a single family rental, you've, you know, it's like your tenant is renting it, they're responsible for pretty much everything, right? They're mowing the lawn, they're shoveling the snow, they're paying the utilities, and yeah, you've got your taxes and insurance and stuff that you're paying for, but pretty much they're taking care of everything. If you're doing a 100-unit multifamily property, you have a staff, right? You have a manager, you have an assistant manager, you have a lead maintenance guy, you have an assistant maintenance guy. Maybe you have a leasing agent, maybe you have a second, a super, on the tech on the property, right? So there's just a whole lot more to um, to be managing than simply the real estate. So that's probably the biggest thing. It is not passive. You're running a business.
Yeah. The one that I got when I made the jump from singles to fives and tens was just the shock. And again, I admit this is a complete error that you're you're managing people
Mhm.
a lot more in multifamily than you are in singles, right? And most single families I own, and I've owned a lot of them over the years, it is relatively passive, right? It can be mailbox money because to your point, they're responsible for water, garbage, mowing the lawns, all of that. And most of them have families and they don't want to be bothered. But when you're in a multifamily, even as small as 5 units, they're little 600 square foot one side by side with, five garages in the back of the lot. You got parking problems, you got noise problems, you got people to deal with. And I did not appreciate just the gargantuan uplift, people management, of drama management. And I say this as a guy who has a property manager, right?
Yeah.
I'm not even getting the phone calls, but I just hear about the phone calls. And yeah, it's once you get out of houses and you go even to 5 units, it's a different ball game. That's the
Yeah.
first thing I got wrong.
I mean, listen, your single family house, I mean, maybe it's possible somewhere, but you're probably not going to ever have a Google review of your
Yeah,
single
probably
family
not.
house,
No,
right? But
no.
if you own multifamily, you will be getting Google reviews of your property, right? And typically, the only time anybody ever writes a Google review about a property is when they have something to complain about. They don't go
Yep.
on and write like, "Oh boy, my experience was so terrific. I never want to leave." They
Right.
only complain. They only write a review when they're pissed off about something. And inevitably, the reason they're pissed off is because it's like, you know, Christmas Eve and something breaks, and the staff is like at home with their family, and nobody has jumped to like deal with their problem in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve,
Hmm.
right away. And so they're annoyed unreasonably in many cases, and then they're going to go and write a Google review, which is going to be there forever, right?
Yeah.
So it's dealing with the people stuff, which is uh, something you just don't have to do with single family.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I always wanted to ask you about, again, Grant Cardone talks about this all the time. I think his latest number is 32 units, right? If you don't buy 32 units, you're a complete loser. And really the story of that is, as I understand it, it's right. One roof, one, heating system,
Mhm.
all of that. Obviously, I think he's talking his book because clearly he's trying to raise capital. So that's not lost on me. I've never owned a 32 unit building, right? The biggest we have is 20. And, uh, you know, do you see do you see bigger is better as being the right, like, is 200 better than 100? Is 300 better than 200? Is it just that simple logic, or is that just the logic doesn't hold?
I mean, on a really simplistic level, yes. The more units you have, the more efficient it is.
Hmm.
So there is that. But the cutoff is not 32 units. I don't know where that number comes from. Typically what we think about is you start getting some economies of scale, maybe at 50, but you really need to get up to 80 before you really start to see it. And the issue again is the staff, right? Because the
Okay.
labor cost is, so your biggest expense with multifamily is your, first is your mortgage, second is your property tax, and then your labor is your
Mm,
biggest expense, right? And so it's very hard. So like at a 50 unit property, you can't afford a full-time staff person there. And it's
right.
very, very hard to find anybody who wants to do it part-time. You can, we've done it, but but it's much easier to own a 50 when you own 100 units next door, right?
Got it.
So um, when you get up to 80, then 80 can usually support like a full-time manager, and then who will also be your leasing agent, and then maybe you have a part-time maintenance person or someone you can call in at that point. But once you get up over 100, you start getting more efficiency. And because you think about just like amortizing the cost of your staff over more units, right? So you only really ever need one manager, one
Mm,
general manager, even for a big property, right? Maybe they're going to need more help, but you're only going to need one manager. Sometimes you can even share managers between properties. Um, and you don't need like, you know, say between 100 units and 125 units, you don't need any more staff for 125 units than for 100, but you
mm,
got 25 more units to amortize the cost over, which is great, right?
yeah.
So the other thing is too, when you get into bigger properties, then you can hire better staff because you can pay more, right? So
Got it.
your ability, rather than offering a salary of 40,000, maybe you're able to offer a salary of 80,000 or 100,000, and you're picking from a different talent pool at
Right.
that point. So that's something to be considered as well.
Yeah. The other thing that I got wrong, and I just love this kind of almost confessional. The other thing I got wrong was I didn't understand turnover,
Mhm.
right? When we just had 8 houses, my turnovers were, you know, very, very, frankly, I don't think we had one since that first eviction on Norris Drive. So I assumed incorrectly again that turnover in smaller multifamilies would be, I mean, I guess I knew it'd be higher, but I had no idea how high it would be, right? Turnover now, 20 years later, in my apartments is just over 2 years, where my houses are over 8 years,
Wow.
right? And turnover is what kills property or investors. So
Yeah.
you've got to budget that.
So turnover is a huge expense, and it's a really hidden expense too, because people often don't really understand how turnover hurts, right? And so what so many people teach you in multifamily is like raise the rents, like go buy something with low rents and raise the rents. Now, if they're not also budgeting turnover, then they're really going to overestimate how much money the property is going to make. And if you push the rents too much, you're going to get more turnover, right? So, and the turnover, right? So think about what it actually costs. You've got to redo the apartment, right? Depending on how, and that's going to cost depending on how bad the damage is, right? Some in the worst case scenario, you might need it to replace I mean, you might need new kitchens, new bath. If it's been a really long-term tenant or they really beat the place up, you might be looking at serious renovation costs, right? But even if it's not, even if it's just repaint, steam clean the carpets, fix what's broken, you're still probably talking $1,000 for a
Oh,
turn.
easy.
Plus,
I've I haven't had $1,000 turn probably in a couple of years.
right. So even more, right? And
Yeah.
and and then you've got the vacancy, right?
Hmm.
So you figure, okay, probably a better estimate of the turn cost is 1 month's rent for turn, right? And then
Sure.
one month's rent for vacancy. If you're really
That's fair.
efficient, maybe you can get it all done. You can get, well, I mean, that's 2 months is going to be your minimum because it's going to basically cost you, it's going to take you 30 days to rent a unit. You have to
Yep.
assume. And
Yep.
then, and you've got that turn, and hopefully you can get that turn done in the 30 days so you don't kick that out even further. But your
Hmm.
minimum turn cost is going to be 2 months of rent. So
Totally
that,
agree.
and
Yep.
you're turning for apartments, like you said, you know, single family house, let's say it's a 3 or 4 bedroom house, right? You've got a family in there, the kids are at school. they're only really going to move if they like buy a house, right? Whereas like your tenants, if it's like if you're especially renting one bedrooms, right, you get very high turnover, right?
Yeah,
It
you
used to
do.
be 50% a year. Now it's
Whew.
a lot lower because because rents are so expensive and it's harder for people to move, but it's still 30 to 35% of your
Yeah,
tenants are
for
going to
sure.
turn over every year.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that when I think about, I
Oh,
always
I'm sorry. Can I
chuckle.
just one, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just one
Yeah,
more
go
point
ahead.
on this. Especially in recent years, a lot of operators that I know have actually found that it is cheaper to give a tenant a rent reduction than it is to turn the apartment.
Oh, no doubt.
So, so
Yes.
if you're managing occupancy, you may, and in a oversupplied market, like a lot of the Sunbelt markets, it's actually better. You're better off giving them a rent concession, giving them a month of free rent, 2 months of free rent,
Absolutely.
whatever, than you are losing that tenant to another property that's giving them a better deal.
Yeah, the thing that I chuckle that you brought up earlier, there's a lot of people kind of the multifamily space saying, "Hey, go find an apartment building that's undervalued rent by $300. Jack up the rent by $300 and, bingo bango, money rains down on you." I always laugh at that because I bought buildings that were drastically under rented, and what people don't tell you is you actually have to go through two at least two tenant cycles to get to quote unquote market, right?
Mm.
You're not going to go into some rundown, 60% of market, fix a unit, and then put a market rate tenant in there. They're not going to want to be around the
Yeah,
other folks. It's just how it works. So you're going to have to take a step process. And what you thought was going to be a 1 year project for the buildings, probably 2 or 2.5 years, because
yeah,
you've got to cycle it twice.
yeah.
Man,
And,
people don't
and
get
you've
that.
got and you've got to spend money on stuff up front that you won't see for a while. Like, so that if you're going to go do one of those projects where you're really ultimately retenanting the building, the first thing you want to tackle is the curb appeal, right?
Correct. The outside.
Like,
Yep.
you got to tackle the outside, and that's not going to change the rents right
No,
away,
no.
but it will over the long term, it will. You have to, but you've got
Mhm.
to tackle that curb appeal first. That's the upfront money that you've got to spend on, fixing everything outside, painting, landscaping, doing all the stuff just to make people notice in the market that this is a different property with a different owner and something new is happening there. And then you've got to start going through that process of, you know, when people
Yeah.
leave, turning the apartments, raising the rents, and so, and you've got to change you got to change the name of the property because probably there's got bad Google reviews or everybody knows it as a bad place,
Yeah.
so there's a lot to do. It's not a simple process of it's not the old Carlton Sheets thing of like, buy it, just raise the rents.
Yeah, no, and there are people still selling that message, right? I'm like, I
Yeah.
laugh all the time, like that people follow this are going to get hurt because it doesn't work that way. And to be clear, this is what I do on single families too. I buy a slumlord single family. I might send the team in to gut the building first, but I will address the outside. I'll
Yeah.
address the outside first because my intention is to rent it before I'm done, right?
Right.
You don't go inside, do all this stuff inside, and then like the outside's still ugly. Nobody's going to stop. But if you go in, you clean up the landscaping, you clean the driveway, you repave if you have to, you paint the thing, you get some shutters, you put on a better door, people are going to stop. Even though the inside's not done, they're going to see that you've fundamentally changed the asset. So that's how I get my properties rented before I'm even done. So that works even on single family. So it's pretty crazy. Um, I guess the other thing about multifamily that I think that the single family investors get is Um, I think, in my opinion, I think single family is far more passive. And again, I'm talking right being an owner of a big building, kind of
Right.
to all of these points. I think people go to bigger units thinking it will be more passive. And maybe that's true to some extent because you have employees, but you're running a business, kind of to your first point. I think people are pretty shocked at hey, I got 100 unit building. I thought it was going to be mailbox money, and damn it, the single family was less work. I'm like, you're right. Single families
Well,
are less work.
yeah, especially if you're trying to run it yourself, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
do ideally want to have third-party management in place, but then you have to manage the manager, and that might not be time consuming, but it's still work.
Oh,
And,
it's still critical.
yeah, and inevitably the property managers, they have, they have different incentives than you have, right? So
Sure.
uh, they're usually not really focused on minimizing cost. And so you have to constantly manage them on minimizing costs, right? And really working with them. And I just see the struggles of
Mm.
people trying to kind of turn around these big properties and even when the properties are in decent condition, you know, it's just it can be a real struggle. And sort of one additional thing that I think people don't understand about multifamily is if you have a single family property, right? If you have a decent, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Michael, but
Mhm.
if you have a decent property, let's just say that your property is like just a little nicer than every other property that's on the market, right? Just you
Mhm.
always make it the point of like making it a nice place to live, right?
Mhm.
You'll be able to rent that property even if occupancy is soft in the market,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
If you have multifamily property, the bigger your property gets, the more your property cannot deviate from the market. Like whatever the if you're at 100 units, usually the thought is that okay, you should be able to manage to 95% occupancy no matter what because you can adjust your rents, you can kind of, whatever. But the bigger you get, like the more your property basically is the market. So if you're up
Uh,
at like 500 units, if if the market occupancy is 90%, it's really really hard to push your occupancy past 90%, right?
yeah.
And the bigger you are, the more sensitive you are to supply and demand in the market. So
Love that.
that's something that people really don't understand.
Love this. Jonathan, this is the game you play, the big stuff. Where can people find you if they want to know more or learn from you?
Yeah, well, always, check me out on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn, tell me you're from ORAD. I'm really happy to get connection requests from people in this community. And I'm in there commenting and posting pretty much every day. So come follow me there. Uh, Also, you can join my coaching community, which is a school group at school.com/AIC, which is short for Apartment Investors Club.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you.